so excited to be able to moderate this and to introduce you, Alan, because I mean, we go way back. Almost 10 years, I think. We were both at DePaul.
Long time.
A long time. And I was brand new and I was super lost. And I was looking up faculty profiles, you know, who are my colleagues here? Who could I possibly have some interesting conversations with? And then I stumbled upon you, Ellen. I just read the profile, storyteller, and then you had this picture where, you know, you were already in the storyteller pose somehow. I was like, oh my God, I have to meet this person. And so I reached out and I sent you an email and we had lunch. And I will never forget this lunch because as far as I remember, we didn't waste any time having any small talk. We just went there, right?
Right in, just dove in deep. It was awesome.
Dove in deep, human experience, metaphors, Edrigor. At the time you were designing Edrigor, and we talked about the manifestations of fears and darkness and all these battles that take place. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is a kindred spirit. This is somebody that I will never let go again.
Oh.
And I haven't. And you made me cry with a deck of cards once, and then you held space for me beautifully. So
yes, I have a new version of those cards too. We have to have a sit.
I can cry again with you. Beautiful. Well, I'm so thrilled. So for those of you in the audience who do not know Ellen, you might wonder, who is this Ellen person? And I have a short bio. And it won't do you justice, Ellen, but I'm going to read it anyways by way of introduction. So Ellen Turner is a game designer, storyteller, artist, author, composer, and performer who has been involved in storytelling and education most of his adult life. He teaches game design at DePaul University and runs the DePaul Originals Game Studio. He believes in the power of play and story as fundamental, powerful medicines, which shape our sense of self, relationships, and our connection to the cosmos. He extols play as a learning tool via workshops and projects for bringing games and game-like learning into our everyday lives to give a sense of progression and purpose and as rites of passage. And your talk, Ellen, is titled Disrupting Monkey, Laughing Raven, the magic of the Tricksters Dance. So please, my dear friend, take it away.
Oh my goodness, thank you for such an awesome introduction. Doris, miss you greatly. Miss our long conversations in the halls and in the offices here at DePaul. So I'm definitely gonna have to get out there to Sweden and so we can chew the fat. Let me switch over to my slides. All right. What's up right now is my opening screen, and the title of this project is Disrupting Monkey, Laughing Raven, the Magic of the Tricksters Dance. And there's this wonderful picture of a crow high on top of a spire that I took at some point when I was in California. Pilamale yelo, haumataki yapi, he hani washte, ampetu washte, anhepi washte, Alan Turner, machiapi yelo, malakota, na masapa, na ma Irish, chante washtea, na pechi yuzape. I introduced myself in Lakota, which is my native tongue. And it basically said, thank you for having me. Hello to you, my relatives. I wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. And I'm Lakota, I'm Black, I'm Irish, and a bunch of other bits of stuff scattered around. And I come to you to share with you, and I greet you with an open heart. So the image that's up on the screen right now is a snapshot of me. It is me in a kind of vermilion, reddish kurta, head thrown back and arms outstretched in a moment of ecstasy. This is one of my first rock sharky performances. I'm a belly dancer as well as all the other stuff. And I have all these other images that I'm going to bring up, and they represent some of the concepts that I identify. So the first is kanji, a crow or a raven, who represents a lot of communal issues for me. There's Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, great sage equal to heaven, who represents so much of that urge to kind of push against the restrictions around me. Iktomi and Nancy, grandmother spider, who represents so much of the capacity to weave and create. And then there's Joaquin Tanka, the great thunderbird, which is a being that raises, and it cleanses, and it lifts up, and it protects. These are all variations of what are often called trickster characters, excuse me, in modern parlance of the Jungian archetypes that people seem to love so much. You would think that someone who spends so much time playing with rules would identify less with being associated with breaking them, but I'll come back to why this is. These are voices, the urges that move with me and guide me as I seek to create, make a difference, make space, and undo what doesn't serve to make room for what does. These are my changers, my dancing tricksters. They are the voices that help me find my lenses. They are always in motion. They're always dancing, never letting me get too comfortable with the way things work, or at least the way I think things work. They make me ask these questions of what I do, and I keep my voice clear and help me keep my voice clear and strong. And so the questions that come up are, how do I build community and kinship with this, whatever this is, whatever the thing is that I'm engaging with? How can it harm community or kinship? What is shiny and exciting that we can play with? And those are from the energy of the crow. From the energy of Sun Wukong, I get, does this serve? Should I or can I break it to make it serve better? And Grandmother Spider encourages me to ask, what can I craft or weave with these pieces in this context? Is there something that might get stuck or that might suffocate as a result of that weaving? And then Joaquin encourages me to ask, what motion does this bring to the world? What gets cleansed or reborn, and what may be raised or destroyed? So before I go on, I should put forth a warning that there will be spiders in this presentation. There's one coming up. And so for those of you who are arachnophobic, I just want to give you a fair warning. There are two images, and they're going to be back to back. The next image will be a spider, and the image after that will be a bunch of fantastic spiders. So of all these trickster characters, of all of these relatives, I've had the longest relationship with Anansi, grandmother spider, basically since I was a little kid. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of how that came to be, how I began this relationships with the tricksters. So this is on the slide is Focus phalangioides. I always have trouble pronouncing that last word, but it is a long-legged. We call them in the U.S. we call them daddy long legs, which is funny because we also call harvestmen, which are these kind of things with the aren't spiders that run around and eat matter on the forest floor. We call that daddy long leg. We also call cream flies daddy long legs. So anytime someone says daddy long legs, you actually have to ask what they mean. But I digress. When I was a child, I couldn't sleep at night. I had night terrors. I had all sorts of night terrors and anxiety issues. There's a nightstand by my bed. And one night I got down on the floor looking for something, and I spied under that stand this huge, messy, thick web. Hidden in the upper darkness of the web was a form that was obviously a spider. It was terrifying. It was huge. I couldn't see it fully, so it also became fascinating because of the mystery of not knowing exactly what it looked like. All the things that I was having nightmares about, I started to project into and put into that dark shape under the nightstand. I worried about it, I thought about it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it and would check for it every night to see if it came down, but it didn't. It stayed up in this little corner. And then it occurred to me one night to try to feed it. So I caught a little cockroach and I got it to somehow run into the web. And as soon as the bug hit one of the strands, that shape came down, moving this stochastic in these stochastic spurts. There were an interesting combination of mechanics, grace, and awkwardness. It got to the roach, pulled it up, wrapped it up in thick, viscous web, and carried it back up into the dark to snack. I was absolutely entranced with this entire spectacle. When I saw this being, I had all these emotions too. I was scared because it was a great big spider. I was ashamed because I had sent that roach to his doom. I was excited because I finally saw the whole spider, right? I was activated and proud because I had fed it, which kind of made it less frightening and more like a pet. I had made an offering to this manifestation of the trickster, and it had accepted. Mind you, I wasn't conscious that I was making an offering to a trickster, but I knew that I was making a connection to something bigger than just me. I was cautious because it was a scary secret. If anyone else found out that this creature was there, it would be killed. So we had this unsaid covenant of observation and respect, and I thought it was both kind of frightening and magnificent. Thereafter, almost every night for a couple months, I was down under that nightstand playing with the spider, learning what I call my focus lessons. Interesting things about the focus, the focity. They have a face that looks like a human skull. If you get really close to it, it's actually got this whole skull-shaped little teeth shapes, and that was just so bizarre and so creepy, but so cool. I also learned that if you poke the web, it did this really interesting thing where it would shake itself really fast, and which was served two interesting purposes. One, to big creatures looking into the web, it made the spider invisible. And to other spiders who would come onto the web, it would make the focus appear to be gigantic. And so there's already this kind of exploration of these crazy tricks. The focus actually did leave its web on a regular basis to go and hunt for other spiders, and it would come back. And also learn that tangle webs, which are very trickstery webs, are one of the most common types of webs. When we think about spider webs, when we think about grandmother spider, people tend to go to the pretty geometric webs of your weavers, but those aren't as common as sheet webs and tangle webs. So learning that there was all these tools, all this creation, all this stuff that my friend was doing was just fascinating. Eventually, it moved on. Mating season came along, but in the time we were together, I learned so much about fear, nourishment, making space, building, discerning between threats, nourishment. I fed her a lot. Distractions. I threw a lot of stuff into that web that wasn't food too, and she was very kind. She would give me this look and just kind of unravel it from the web and toss it out. But beyond all of that, I had a friend. Ever since then, I've had this love-respect affair with spiders. They've taught me much, and the connection was so deep that they became core to my own creations. So here, appearing at the top of the slide, are images of the ectome, which are the large spider creatures that populate all of Edgegore. And it was my homage to that moment that I had with a spider under the dresser. But it was also a reminder that Edgegore was a world about creating and making and weaving and unweaving. And so so many of the animals in the world are replaced with different types of spiders. And then so much of the cosmic stuff, I also engage with spiders. So there are spiders on the ground and there are spiders in the sky. There's spiders in the stars and there are spiders in people's dreams. They were everywhere, always inviting folks to create. So we're done with the spiders for a minute. So yeah, those of you who hate spiders, we're moving on. So a little bit more about me. When I was a little boy, I lived in the few perpetual states, which you see here on the slide. And also, you see on the slide is a picture of me as a little boy with my big old cheeks and my plaid shirt and my fuzzy hair. I lived in a few perpetual states: fear, curiosity, creation, destruction, play, usefulness, being useful, and then being invisible when things kind of got scary. They were a mixture of multiple little transformations that I was constantly undergoing to survive in a less than ideal home. I wasn't on any kind of heroic path. I was actually doing all I could to twist the realities around me to create a safe place for me to catch my breath. And more often than not, I did it through play. I was always coming up with stuff to do. Everything around me was a toy, and most people didn't know it yet. I was always trying to create an internal and external narrative where I was safe and seen. Now, a lot of times when we talk about narratives, when people come to talk about crafting narratives and engaging narratives and creating games, they tend to come at it from the point of view of the hero's journey, which is of course popularized in the late 80s through the Bill Moyers interviews with Joseph Campbell, entitled The Power of Myth, and Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure of Storytellers and Screenwriters in 1992. And then by everyone else who's come since then, especially as we've delved deeper and deeper into how to make a game and come up with all these game tropes. People just keep going down the rabbit hole of the hero's journey. It's a useful model, but not really, but it's not the model that I'm here to talk about, but I just want to acknowledge it because it's the model that most people are familiar with. You're all teachers and scholars and people who make and seek, in my opinion. And so I'm not coming to you with that same old narrative, which doesn't always work for many of us. I want to offer you a different take on growth, which is less about conquest and battles and self-annihilation and elixirs, and instead one of movement and co-creation, and I call it the Tricksters Dance. So the Tricksters Dance is about a bunch of things for me. It's staying in motion, it's coming to terms with one's power to create and embracing eldership. It's developing the ability to perceive narratives and forces that form the context of our interactions and our traditions. Being able to poke at the threads of said traditions and see which ones serve and which ones distract. Most importantly, it's about the power of the trickster's voice, because the trickster's form is malleable. What form the trickster takes on any given day doesn't matter. What the trickster says and what the trickster does, that is what changes the world. In 2014, I published a tabletop role-playing game called Edgegore, the role-playing game. I like to call it a game of post-cataclysmic tribal horror. In it, you play people trying to live in a world of beauty and splendor and madness and sorrow. One of my Kickstarter backers wrote this tagline for me, which is, heroes stand against the encroaching darkness and humanity's eternal divisions in a world drawn from indigenous mythology. The core functionality of it is, well, actually, before I get into that, the image that's up on screen right now is the cover of, is a stretched out cover of the book. It was a cover created for me by artist Valerie Zanos, and it kind of pictures a lot of the dream world, the spirit world, and trickstery energy that's kind of inherent inside the making and continual transformations in Edgegore. The core functionality of the game is the fate system, which generally tries to focus on moving dramatic moments forward instead of lots of crunchy rules and inventory. So it was well received. I had a very successful Kickstarter for the time. But over the years, looking back, I've been coming to terms with the thought that making Edgegore came in layers and passes. I threw lots away before I had something that worked, and sometimes I wasn't even aware that I was in the process of creation. Part of the problem I realized in retrospect is that I didn't know what I wanted. When I started working on it, I wasn't yet in the space of becoming a creator. I was somewhere else. I was in this place of having conversations with this powerful creation impulse. It didn't want to make, it didn't just want to make, it wanted to change something. It wanted to change me, the players, expectations, old narratives, the world, so much more. And so I went with it. And then that led me in the process of engaging that to really stop and think about my own process and how I've grown and how I see others growing. Excuse me. I have this thing that I work with when I work with youth. I present it as the ways that people move through the process of creation. I also use it with teachers when I work with teachers and kids, and anybody who's in that space of trying to get into a make mind. It comes from my observations of years of youth work and family work, and also a hypervigilance of my own processes. And it looks like this. On this white screen, you see up here the word consumers in the left quadrant. In the northern quadrant, the upper quadrant, the word curators appears. To the right, the word creators appears. And then down below is the word changers. So consumers, curators, creators, changes. These are the states. These are the stages. The space of being a consumer is one of appetites. it's a seeking out and adding things to ourselves in an attempt to see what sticks and what makes us feel better. Like a little caterpillar moving all through the trees, we're eating everything. And that's the image that we see here is a green caterpillar moving across the tree limb. It is a space of attempted nourishment. Every time we find something that appears appetizing, we bring it in and consume it. It's one of the driving forces behind our capitalist culture, actually. So much that we're constantly bombarded by things that urge us towards consumption. As creators and experience makers, this is merely a nascent phase, though. And so again, the consumer is seeking nourishment. They're collecting, they're metabolizing. They have this constantly growing appetite. As we consume, we keep growing and changing along the way. Well, there's more yet to come. Eventually, and now we have a picture of a moth here. We move into the space of being a curator, and a curator is interesting because it's very much like the consumer, but we're much more mindful about our consumption. We know that particular things nourish us, and we begin to build narratives and identities around those things, and we actually have an identity as opposed to just being a consumer. We're starting to get a sense of who we are, and we begin to use our collections to delineate that the identity. That's how we begin to create our borders. And then we hit the stage of the creator, where we decide that we can make something of our own, or we've been inspired to try to do something better than another person has done. So the creator space is a space of making, but it's often coming right out of that curator space. So it's making, but in a space of replication. We've seen something else, and so we're kind of making more of that something. Or it's very myopic, where we've just kind of super focused on a small type of thing or a particular type of thing that we're trying to make. It's definitely inspired by the curation and lives alongside of it. And we have this sense that we're going to make something awesome. We're just going to blow the world's mind. In reality, it's a mess, right? Oh, there's another spider. I forgot about that one. So it's a messy process. It's not always elegant like we hope it is. And people from outside are often terrified by it, right? Sometimes they're telling us we're doing it wrong. Sometimes they're absolutely frightened about what we're doing because it's going to disrupt tradition. It's going to do whatever. And then there's all this problematic junk from the scaffolding that we have from our curations, right? So there's all these old narratives that we still have identity, and so we're trying to hold on to those things while we're doing the making, and we're just working from this reactionary and instinctive space. One of my other colleagues, Artemisia Divine, has lots of thoughts about this whole process, where she kind of flips through different stages of engaging with the world. And I'll get to her in a little bit later on in the slide, but recognizing that we're in a reactionary space where we think that we have arrived and we've awakened, but we haven't. And then there is the changer, right? And we're in this big, beautiful, world-changing butterfly. There's a big picture of Mothra here. At that point, there's this with the changer, there's this huge transformation. You return to your beginnings, sort of, but now you've figured out some of the essential truths about yourself, and you cause people to rethink and consider whenever they engage with you. Every time you talk, every time you show, every time you're in space, people are either being activated or they're being repulsed, right? That engagement isn't necessarily a comfortable one. And you yourself continue to rethink and consider whenever you engage with others, and you kind of go, and it goes around and around. However, it's not a linear process. The image that's just come up is that of a flock of starlings murmurating. I consider this transformation from consumer to changer. It goes hand in hand with the small lights that come on as one moves back and forth between these states. Each time you visit one, you gain a new insight, you get a new step, you get a new tool, you get a new block to build with, and that's fuel for weaving. And that's the dance. There's no real end state. There's no line. There's no singular path. To survive it, you have to be fluid, and it's a motion of murmuration. Just like if you ever watched a flock of starlings or watched a big flock of pigeons, they do this thing where they all come together, and then they form a shape, and then they disperse, and then they form a shape, and then they disperse, and then they kind of move around and around and around, and this awesome ballet in the sky, filled with all sorts of forms, all sorts of realizations, and then they settle. So it is a dance. For many of us, we don't have personally singular journeys. We explore and we molt like beetles, and not just going from caterpillar to butterfly. We move and we recover. We do it over and over so many times that we lose count. Each pass brings us closer and closer to the truth of us and our expression. And we find that voice, right? We find that thing that makes the world take notice. My own path has bounced around a whole bunch, and I believe this is how the trickster moves through and around us to keep us in motion. So I keep saying this word, trickster. Let's talk a little bit about what the trickster is. Let's get to some definitions. Images that are up there is me dressed up in my manifestation as Aoife Stormcrow. This is one of my dance personas, and just an image of a person standing before this grand maze, prepared to enter and try to navigate it. So Carl Jung, who we is the name most associated with archetypes and whatnot, has this to say about the trickster, and this comes from the 4 archetypes. He is a forerunner, quote, he is a forerunner of the Savior, and like him, God, man, and animal all at once. He is both subhuman and superhuman, a bestial and divine being, whose chief and most alarming characteristic is his unconsciousness. Because of it, he is deserted by his evidently human companions, which seems to indicate that he has fallen below their level of consciousness. He is so unconscious of himself that his body is not a unity, and his 2 hands fight each other. He takes his anus off and entrusts it with a special task. Even his sex is optional despite its phallic qualities. He can turn himself into a woman and bear children. From his penis, he makes all kinds of useful plants. This is a reference to his original nature as a creator, for the world is made from the body of a god. Again, that's from the 4 archetypes, one of Jung's books, where he goes into not just the trickster, but the mother and the spirit, and I forgot what the 4th one was. He also engages with this idea, this word, enantiodromia, which has this thought that the trickster has this tendency to turn things into his opposites. I don't fully agree with it, because I don't feel like there's this urge, and a lot of this is kind of coming from more that white patriarchal, old school way of thinking, where we want to try to shove everything into these binaries. And I don't believe the trickster necessarily just changes things into their opposite. I think the trickster changes things into alternate essentials. And again, we'll come back to this. Let me move this window out of the way. So we look at Paul Radin in his book, The Trickster, A Study in American Indian Mythology. He quotes, "The trickster is at one and the same creator and destroyer, giver and negator. He dupes others and who is always duped himself. He knows neither good nor evil, yet he is responsible for both. He possesses no values, moral or social, yet through his actions, all values come into being." And that starts to get a little closer to my experience with the trickster, but it's not quite there yet. So when I stop and ask, Alan, what do you think a trickster is? What is your experience with the trickster, from grandmother spider through your crows, through rabbits, all the things around you? What comes to mind for me is that the trickster is the ultimate manifestation of the modern term, fuck around and find out, right? This is literally how the trickster gets better. With each survival, the trickster is a new being. Sometimes trickster dies, but they never let that hold them back. Trickster asks some fundamental questions of the world around them, when they basically are why, how, what the fuck, and why not. These questions are important because they're directly connected to what I feel is the trickster's greatest power, where Jung kind of leaned into this idea of their unconsciousness being this big power. I don't think it's unconscious. I don't think that the trickster is ever really unconscious. I think the trickster is actually fairly conscious most of the time. And so for me, that power is in the trickster's voice. Again, the form is malleable. But the voice is where they begin to enact the verbs that are their manifestations. The trickster is growth and transformation. Trickster sets the pace for the happenings in creation. It is the impulse. Like all the archetypes, it has a dark side. But it's interesting that when we think about the other archetypes, there's a hero and the villain and the king and the tyrant and so on and so forth. We tend to look at those other archetypes and kind of default to what we consider to be the good version or the healthy version of the archetype. And when we start talking about a trickster, everyone gets nervous. It's really hard for many people in our current world to see the trickster as a positive, there's a tendency to immediately jump to the trickster as deceiver. But all of the archetypes have this dark side. And for the trickster, there's the trickster who exists to educate and impart wisdom. And then there's a trickster who exists to create misery and to monger trouble. And sometimes it's one or the other. Sometimes they're both at the same time. Sometimes they're neither. The trickster doesn't care. Right? The trickster does its own thing. It does what's needed in the moment. So when we talk about games and experiences, we often frame the identity and meaning of a game in relationship with the verbs and actions of the game. While the narrative gives the game a wrapper, the verbs is what the game or experience is really about. That it's the ritual of the game. When I think of the experience of the trickster, these actions stand out to me that I have on the slide right now as being central to the trickster. And these verbs are consume, right? The trickster is eternally hungry. Create, the trickster has a create as part of their consumption. Consummation, the trickster is always building relationships. And sometimes the trickster is also breaking relationships. We'll come back to how that works. They instigate, they interrogate, they investigate, they activate, they evacuate. Sometimes in doing all these other things, they get themselves in trouble, and then it's time to beat a hasty retreat. They disintegrate, they destroy things around them, not just to destroy, but to make room for new growth. And then they survive. They go through all these things, they engage all these bits and pieces, and they're always making room for themselves. In their descriptions, both Young and Radin center the trickster as a him who can take on other forms. I'd rather think of it as an experience that assumes innumerable physicalities. Gender is meaningless to the trickster. They possess both seed and womb. They're not cis hetero, gay or bi, trans or non-binary, in as much that they are gender polymorphic. They are what they are when they are, and the next time that they are, they may be different. That it's a function of necessity and need and their own desires. Coyote, in the stories of many native nations, as well as Loki, give birth to many children, and also sires many. From Trickster's purview, we all have wombs of a sort. Babies, poetry, stories, systems, structures, they're all relatives and ecologies. They are all life from an indigenous perspective, which is a perspective that those that both Radin and Young kind of discard as they mine indigenous spaces, for example, to confirm their own ideas and patriarchal narratives. So since we all possess seed, then we are able to instigate life as well as fully bring it into being. So to kind of punctuate this, I feel like they're gender polymorphic. They have whatever form they need to have. So I think we tend to think of, like, these male characters, but there's plenty of female tricksters. There's in American folklore, there is in Norse folklore, just to compare against Loki, there's Ellie, who is the personification of old age, right? And she's the one being who's actually able to beat Thor in a wrestling match. There's lots of variations of jack tales, which include female counterparts. And sometimes the trickster isn't human at all, and sometimes it doesn't even have a physical form. They are singular and plural as they need to be, where a monkey can jump in there and engage a battle all by itself, or if it needs backup, monkey makes its own backup by summoning more of itself, right? But for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to lean into they it pronouns as a quick shorthand to remind us of this fact that they have no particular gender ideal, and they're singular and plural. They're all this stuff at all times. So I would go so far as to say that the gender of a trickster is not any physical manifestation, but in their expression and interaction with the world. So here's a what if for you. What if we listen to the trickster and cast the term gender aside completely, and instead we use the term resonance? And then now it becomes more about what is your resonant kinship, right? What resonates with you? What responds to the song that you emit? What responds to the way that you move through the world? What songs and emotions in the world do you resonate with? Can you build a nourishing ecology by focusing in on your resonations? And that, to me, opens up so much more possibility for connection and relationship, being seen and seeing others. The trickster loves to consummate and to build connections and relationships. Others are also drawn to the trickster because of the trickster's resonance, which is awesome because people know better. They know that the trickster is going to be up to no good. They know that the trickster is going to create a mess, but people come to see what's going to happen anyway. It's like this great fire that you can't look away from, this wonderful train wreck, right? And we can even go even further with this idea of resonance. We could use resonance or variations of that idea to describe family, culture, race, ethnicity, occupation, the list goes on. If we look at them in terms of how they connect you to the world, these things become so much less restrictive that way. It begins to be about trickster as our desires and needs and interactions, and less about boxes that define our use or places us in a suffocating society of boxes. So speaking of desire, there's this idea of desire being a trickster. So what's up on the screen right now is an image of Artemisia Divine, who she has a bunch of different titles for herself. The one that I especially like is erotic choreographer. Divine is a colleague and one of my best friends. She's a retired sex worker and deep thinker who dedicates herself to providing guidance and coaching to people to help them recenter by connecting to and listening to the desire and learning to understand the metaphors about being used by their own subconsciousness as impulses to help them to gain momentum in connecting to themselves. Over the pandemic, she and I have had multitudes of late night Zoom conversations about the natures of play and desire, where they overlap and where they're different. So the quote here comes from an article about hidden treasures in one's sexual desires and turn-ons. And the quote is, inside the ocean of your unconscious, there is a precious treasure. It is full of important insights about the parts of yourself that you're not normally aware of. These parts of you are that mysterious thing that you are in contact with when your creativity, inspiration, and vitality is flowing. Think artists, dancers, and musicians in the flow, an inventor downloading a whole new concept, or even a martial artist in the flow of combat, where they're no longer thinking, but moving from some nameless instinct. And of course, the best sex comes from this place of flow too, right? Where you just kind of, you're seeing the other person. You get into a space where you're engaging each other and you're just well played. I think that this hews much closer to the way the desire, that impetus moves us forward, and I think that's kind of the boon companion of the trickster. So she and I are both in agreement that there is this inherent wisdom and knowing within us that we have been trained to ignore, trained to kind of see as a bad thing. Even when people are trying to engage some of this stuff as, maybe they're going into being tantrikas or whatever, there's this focus on being good boys or good girls. And, I'm going to do sex, but I'm going to do it in a way that's healthy. And the trickster doesn't care about all that stuff. The trickster says you need to engage what you need to engage to connect to what you need to connect to. So through erotic play, explorative play, listening, paying attention to roles in our lives, we learn to see truths so much more clearly. The trickster is this impulse. Through it, to find ourselves, we begin to build our own world. This really stands out when we engage in play and games, and in role-playing games especially. So the image here is from when not long after I launched Edgewater, the role-playing game, I had to sit down for Native Heritage Day at UIC, and was trying to get people to come and play the game. And what I wound up with was a bunch of moms who had never played a role-playing game. They were a bunch of indigenous moms, and they got so into it. They were so surprised, and they walked away with like these images in their head and the sense of action in this ongoing story, and they wanted to get back to it. So in role-playing games, I feel like the trickster is everywhere, but that's not the framing that most of us are given. We're told that it's about the heroic journeys, right? And that the trickster is kind of a character type in the game. I think our instinct is to see it in the guise of rogue type characters. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, in games similar to its style, there are these sneaky characters who are ultimately defined by their ability known as the backstab. There's already an inherent distrust of the archetype directly woven into his nomenclature and the details. That ability could easily have been named something like critical strike or deft blow or opportunistic incision or whatever, but it's named the backstab, which suggests that every time you use it, you're doing something wrong. And back in the day when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was a youth, that was always a struggle, just to be able to get to do a backstab. I had to often fight my game masters because there was like this inherent morality to using the backstab. And so I wound up being a thief who didn't get the backstab a whole lot because it was a cheat. And every time you use it, you're doing something wrong. You're not the hero, and everything about you is an insult to the hero who can hold their own in a stand-up face-to-face fight, which is what the game is about, being heroic. A fair fight where opponents trade blows, parries, and parrying and pounding until one of them falls, working through their hit points. So it's originally named the Thief, but it has since been renamed Rogue in later editions. There's different names for the use of the ability, but there's still a little bit of that carryover, that legacy of it's not really a good thing, and you got to watch people who play this character. Other games slowly remove the class archetype altogether and focus on creating capacities for players to create the character that they want. However, people still gravitate towards the templates, and those templates greatly favor the Eurocentric idea of the hero. But I feel that the Trickster in games isn't about class, it's about the game, right? Role-playing games are the tricksters. The game itself is a trickster. In the context of the RPG, we are constantly being invited to transform. And there's so many parts of that transformation. The player transforms into whatever the character is, the playing surface. We project the world onto. The room changes with the narrative that we're engaging in. The game master or storyteller takes on all of these different roles along the way. The dice and the play assets, they're there to activate and enhance our imaginations. Their relationships that we're building with the people around us, and the list goes on. It's all about transformations all the time. Everyone is actively participating in this space of make-believe, is active world building, taking on forms consciously and unconsciously, and exploring structures and motifs and ideas of themselves that they might not be comfortable doing in the containers of their everyday lives. Just checking the time. And speaking of personal transformations, I did a talk last year for the University of Kansas where I spent a great deal of time in reverie about when I got my first D&D box set. And that's the image you see on the slide right now. On the left-hand side of the slide is the original D&D basic set, which is a red box set, had this Elmore art on it of some warrior doing some very awkward lunge towards a great big red dragon that's about to eat him a lot. But in the talk, it was about a reverie about how I got my first D&D box set and how that led me on the journey of role playing and world building. It was mostly about the process of world building, but there's some glossed over nuggets from the talk of my own becoming that are worth revisiting. So my own blood family, I grew up in a tough space. There's abuse, there's sexual abuse, there's all kinds of uncomfortable things happening in my household. And so my blood family was severely problematic. But in the course of engaging with the role-playing games, I found a group of young people who became like family, right? They became, in Lakota, what we would call our Tioshbe, this extended family, spirit family. And in the space held by them, and by me for them, I was able to become myriad different selves and not be judged for the manifestations. So then those characters were this important part of my emotional growth. So here's a short list of some of my favorite characters that still have a bit of meaning to me. There's Luco, who's this powerful psychic who didn't need anybody and could do everything. He was very stoic and was very practical and just did what needed to be done. And that was a very big part of who I was at the time. That was a very big part of my own survival of the world, was kind of to be as self-contained as possible. Saint Heaven of the Word was an old school bard and druid, and engaged in all kinds of things about nature, and was always trying to help people figure out how to build a better connection with the ecology around them. There's Mortimer Fade, who was my great trickster. Mortimer was a character who was an amalgam of things. He was considered as a twisted half-breed, and part of his tricksterness was actually about creating spaces so that he can be seen. All he wanted was people to kind of see him for who he was and not judge him based on their narratives or where he came from. Baladan was a mighty warrior for the light who was going to fight the good fight for everybody. Wada Bojani was a displaced queen who did what she felt like she needed to do to survive in the world. And if that meant poisoning a few people here and there, that was okay. Arwen Laucoin and Faltiona are these characters who are stepping into the space of rulership and leadership with other people. And depending on how I was feeling on any given day, I was one or the other. Ravanifer was this character who was a priestess of light, who was so focused on her light that she wasn't always aware of how much what she considered to be a constant positive could also be toxic in certain places. Brother Callias, Priest of Death, was a huge moment for me where I was this character who I was not an evil god priest of death. I was a good priest of death, and I was all about that, being a psychopomp and bringing people to a gentle repose. And it was important in my life because it put me into this this state where the game master at the time, one of my best friends, Bill, died from renal failure. And the energies that I had engaged as Callias and his adventures led me to, when we found his body in his apartment, to take on that role. And I was able to help the police to carry his body out, into the truck, and then went back and cleansed his apartment of all the blood and bile that spilled out from his death, and to prepare it for his mother's visiting, to sit with his mother. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't built that relationship with death through that character, and a relationship with death to the person who just died through that character. And the weird Lady of Chaos just didn't care. She just blew stuff up because sometimes you just need to blow stuff up. There's Normal Man, who's my superhero, that didn't have any outward powers, but he could call on the abilities of animals and plants around him, and he wanted everyone to take him seriously, even though he didn't have a big snazzy thing to do. And then there's Kaltiki, who just loved everybody, crazy, not a hedonist, but he came from a world that said there is pain and suffering everywhere. So you have to celebrate the people in front of you right now, because you don't know if you get a chance to tomorrow. So he was always in a space of celebration. Every one of those characters was a becoming. Each of those characters was an exploration into a piece of myself that was normally unseen. Some were conscious and some were unconscious. Some were absolutely ridiculous, while others were just dead serious. And I think that's important because in the Trickster spaces, I feel like we're revealed. In the forums I took, my friends saw me, and they began to know my type, right? What was my creative type? Where was my energy coming from? They understood my resonance. They would come across classes and games, and they start to understand what connected to me and what worked for me, what resonated with me, and they would kind of direct me towards those things and show me those things. They went out their way to create adventures to allow me to be seen and to allow me to play with an idea. They allowed me to be the goodest of the good and the most wicked I could be. I was a great evil character. I actually got kicked out of the game because I was so good at being evil. But when it was over, we laughed, right? There was no judgment. The things that I was doing wasn't me. There were pieces of this growth that was happening. We became immortal and uncontained with every manifestation, every character that we portrayed and engaged with. All of us got bigger for that engagement. And so there's a kinship that's being built. The structures of the games we played eventually adjusted, and through our own efforts, we were able to make sure that everybody had space and were seen. And not every game group does this, right? I've especially learned this as I've tried to find places to game and play with people. I realized there are people who play in stores for a reason, because nobody wants them at their house, right? But if you can find that group, there's a relationship that gets built. Everyone gets to do things that were important to them. And by this seeing, by this engaging with each other, by this recognizing of each other's resonances, we begin to not just build kinship, but we build this history, right? There's the narrative history of the game we play, but there's this emotional history of struggles and having gone through struggles together and support each other through struggles and interrupted each other in tight spots and having saved each other in impossible places. And to me, your gaming group becomes this interesting variation of a polyamorous relationship of radical acceptance. We just, once we have the people that work, they just work, and we accept them, and we go out of our way to engage them and connect with them. And so we even wind up with these people in our groups that other people looking on the outside in will go, why do you hang out with that person? That person's weird, that person blah blah blah, this or that. And the answer is in the kinship, right? The emotional connections that we have built in that space of serving and seeing and supporting over so many years. We recognize each other as complex and always in flux, and our mistakes add to our story, but we are not the mistakes. We're not just defined by those moments in the way that we often are defined by our mistakes in our day-to-day regular lives. We become well played, right? Bernie DeKoven, in his wonderful book, The Well Played Game, he goes in depth into this idea of that special thing that emerges between people engaged in play, where the rules become less important than this sense of fairness, presence, and relationship that arises in the play. Right? We become well played. We are more engaged in that flow, that thing that's manifesting between us. And that thing is that trickster energy. I feel like that it's a very special kind of world building that exists beyond any particulars of the game or the game setting. It is the building of a safe space. We're creating a space where you are allowed to be what you need to be. Again, you get to be polymorphic, you get to be gender polymorphic, you get to be culture polymorphic, societally polymorphic. Just get to be what you need to be in the moment. This is why all the conversations that are currently happening in the space of LARPing and tabletop role-playing games and just play spaces in general, all these conversations about racism and sexism, gender, consent, colonial legacies, patriarchy, privilege, etc. These things are erupting in our real world, and they're super important to have in the communities that center around our play. Because again, it's about this building of a safe place. We're being forced to ask these essential trickster questions that I mentioned earlier, and we'll look at it again. In our world buildings, we're always making room for something. World building is about making room for an experience. So we have to be mindful about what that is. Are you world building and making room for intolerance? Or are you world building and making room for acceptance? We begin transforming our expectations of narrative, and then our narratives begin to change. And then as our narratives change, those narratives begin to change us. And so there's this cyclical, nourishing ecology that builds up out of this experience. So I encourage you to embrace the trickster spirits in your games, in your game playing, your game making, any experience creation that you're doing. Dance with your tricksters. When everyone dances with their trickster, one emerges from the experience with brand new eyes and brand new breaths. One will be connected deeper to essential truths and be further removed, but still have an understanding of the illusions and the obstacles and the distractions. You know they're there, and you begin to think of them as the bits, right? You don't necessarily moralize them as much as you try to figure out where do they fit. I like to think of, there's this cartoon from Disney, Lilo and Stitch, where Stitch has to go out and find his family and bring his family together. And in most cases, when Stitch comes across members of its family, it's other little monsters, and those monsters are causing havoc. And they're causing havoc because they're in the wrong place. And so Stitch works really hard to bring people back together and to find their one true place, right? Find that place where, rather than causing trouble, they become medicine, they become nourishment, they become power, they become this creative force that helps other people around them. It becomes easier when we do that to laugh at the things that are in front of us and to say, what if? And that what if becomes less about lining up to fight, right? It's not about fighting the problem. It's about looking on the other side of the problem and figuring out, what does it look like on the other side? What's the world on the other side of this thing look like? How do we bring as many people who are here right now to the other side of this problem? It's not about fighting the problem. It's about transforming the space so that the problem isn't the thing that punctuates our existence. The problem is the beginning of a new existence. So, and I ask you a question, are you really trying to create another hero's journey? Or is it more about creating space to witness a grand unfolding? And then what's unfolding? Is it you? Is it your family? Is it your game? Is it your play spaces? Is it all of that? ask those questions, engage those questions, lean into that trickster, listen to what it has to say. We all have our little tricksters that dance around us. Don't be afraid of them. Sit back, open your mind, open your heart to them, and see where they direct you. I have one more quick little story, and that is when I was working in Edgewater, my older sister had been diagnosed with a cancer, and so she was back and forth in the hospital getting treatment. Sometimes she had long stays, and I would go and visit her. At the time, I was also working on Edgewater, trying to figure out what belongs in the world. And so I would regularly have these moments where I would wake up from dreams and go, oh, that, and run out, like jot notes down, and it would make its way into the world. And as I was leaving the hospital, I was in a space where I was looking for, I was trying to figure out what do people do for horses in this world. And I couldn't see it. Like I was initially in the initial works, it was all about just horses, people running around riding horses, but I felt like that was just so normal and it wasn't right. It just didn't resonate. And so I'm walking out of the hospital, and they have like this little garden space. I'm walking to the path of the garden space, and this rabbit comes out of nowhere, and it kind of sits in the path right in front of me. And I'm like, hey, rabbit, what's up? And the rabbit just kind of looks at me, and it won't move. I'm like, what's going on, rabbit? And the rabbit just kind of looks at me. It sniffs to the ground, and it just kind of sits there and it's like staring me down. I'm getting freaked out by this rabbit. And I ask out loud, rabbit, what are you trying to tell me? What's going on? And I'm starting to back away from the rabbit, and then like this voice just so loudly in my head says rabbit, and then the rest of my body is the whole body reaction goes rabbits, and at that moment I saw these giant hares that people were riding around in the world, and that was what got the hares into Edgewater as like this main transport and beast of burden. It came from an experience with a little trickster moment. And as soon as I said that, as soon as I went, oh, rabbits, I got it, and said thank you to the rabbit looked at me and they just hopped off. So listen to your tricksters when they show up. Ask the questions. How do I build community and kinship with this? How can it harm community or kinship? What is shiny and exciting that we can play with? Does it serve? Can you break it? Should you break it? What can you craft or weave with the pieces? Is there something that might get stuck or suffocate? What motion does this bring to the world? What gets cleansed or reborn? When we get raised or destroyed? This is the systems thinking that the tricksters bring us to. Ask these questions in as many ways possible, and recognize that trickster energy, at the end of the day, there's only one way to decide and find out what the truth is, and that is fuck around and then find out. That is the power, that is the path, that is the energy of the trickster. Thank you for making space to receive my thoughts. I appreciate being able to be here to share these ideas with you. There's a short bibliography. I'll make this available to Sarah and a bunch so that people can pull it down. And I'm easily reached either via my DePaul address, which is 808@depaul.edu, my Gmail, which is ecologies@gmail.com, which is interesting because when I first chose that email address, ecologies in Lakota was meant to be Black Crow. And when there's been many instances where people have made dictionaries and tried to translate Lakota into a written form. And back then, listening to elders and looking at how they wrote things, they would say kanji. They'd be like this kind of slightly verbalized at the beginning of kanji. And so it was written as ICAGI. And then in newer versions, it is now kanji with a KHANGI to verbalize crow. But I've opted to stick with ecology because it actually makes for conversation, right? It's an opportunity to engage and build some relationship. So I'm also found on Twitter at Council of Fools, and there's my blog, which I update sometimes regularly, sometimes not, as the trickster moves me, and that can be found at council-of-fools.com/blog. Thank you. And I guess now we can, I'm open for questions if there are questions to be had.
Thank you so much, Alan. Amazing. We have questions. I'm going to the Q&A window here. Let's see. So first question from Hanne. I'm reading it. In Nordic mythology, we are well known with the trickster Loki, and they appear in our LARPs/RPGs. But what do you think of the mythological Greek creatures, gods and demons of Pan and Baphomet? Tricksters? A whole erotic LARP universe are created around them. And what about Lucifer? Trickster?
So I say yes to that, right? All of those things are trickster things, and it also speaks to this this thing where, as I mentioned earlier, where we immediately kind of come across a trickster character and we kind of default to the dark side of it. And in the space of the kind of that in the Abrahamic religions, right, where we have there are lots of other tricksters. In some cases, there are angels and things that do trickster type things, but we recognize in our cultures, I think we have this tendency to lean into the dark side of the trickster because we recognize that as the rule breaker, and we and so it becomes so much easier to kind of push against that. It's so much easier to lean into Loki than it is to think about, like, I don't know, the boulder that Sisyphus pushes up and down in Tartarus, right? That boulder is a lesson. That boulder itself is a trick. The boulder is this experience, but it's so much harder to relate to that moment and see ourselves as learning anything in that context. But we like the idea of being the trickster who just kind of comes in and just kind of kicks stuff over and ruins stuff and breaks things and then runs off laughing, right? We love our Daffy Ducks. we love our Bugs Bunnies, and those kind of tricksters. The meanness is kind of rebellious, but we don't have to be mean to rebel. We don't have to be mean and destructive to bring change. And all those characters, Lucifer, Baphomet, Loki, they're not limited to those stories that show them in the dark space. But we tend to focus and continue to share the stories that are the darker stories. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question a bit. And Loki is not mean at all. Yeah, I see this in the text, but sometimes Loki is mean. Sometimes his meanness shows up in extreme selfishness. Sometimes he just ruins stuff. And he's definitely mean when Ragnarok kicks in, right? At that point, he's vengeful. He's angry. He's been been chained down, in this cavern with a serpent's acid dripping in his face, and his wife is trying to catch as much as she can. He has been tormented, and he has been shoved aside so much that his disquiet has grown so immense that when it comes out, it is disruptive. At that point, Loki becomes, monstrous and like Godzilla and everybody around him. And I think the same thing applies to like all of these other dark tricksters.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alan. There is another question here, this time from Caleb. Thank you for this excellent talk, Ellen. I'm really interested in the deep connections I'm hearing you describe between creative practice, play, and life/being. I'm wondering, on the other hand, if you feel there are cases where separation between these things is appropriate, and if so, what guidance you have about setting boundaries. I think that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, right. So I'm all about bringing things close together, but sometimes before you can find the place where things connect, you have to kind of define them a little bit. You have to find sufficient words and sufficient boundaries to understand what the limits of that thing are, and then only then can you actually begin the assemblage, right? You can't without understanding how they work. It's just like when we start learning film. One of the first things that a lot of students want to do is they want to jump in and just start filming willy-nilly. But one of the first things we have to do is learn like the 180-degree rule, right? Understanding where the camera sits on that line and how that affects the narrative. And by understanding that boundary, that makes the thing that you create that much stronger. So yeah, I absolutely feel like sometimes we have to separate, and sometimes as we're building those relationships, we recognize that proximity is an issue. will come across situations, things, and people who that when they're too close or they're too far, they're damaging and destructive to us. But if we can find that sweet spot, and communicate that sweet spot, then they become nourishing. In the game Scion, which is the Onyx Path game, where you're playing children of the gods, and it was a game that I wrote for. There was this, in the most recent version, there is this idea of titans and primordials, or gods and primordials, and understanding the difference, that the primordials are like this intense manifestation of a thing, and then gods are a representation of an idea. And so we would compare like Apollo versus Helios. Helios being a primordial who is the sun. He's on fire. It's sun, right? And there's Apollo, who is the representation of the sun, and he's all sexy and cool, and he's got his like bronze skin and beautiful eyes and all that jazz. When Apollo comes out, everyone goes, "Yay, it's Apollo!" And everyone runs around and hugs. They do rites and festivals in Apollo's name, and everything's all great, and we're awesome. Helios shows up and everybody dies, right? And it's because both of them have access to the same power, but Helios is all fire all the time, and Helios doesn't understand that we have an inherent allergy to fire. And so Helios wants to go and hug you, and you burn and you die. And Helios like, well, what's that all about? And they just don't get it. And so people have to convince Helios that our relationship with you is best when you're way over there. If you get up there in the sky, you give us some warmth, we're all cool, Helios, but don't come to my party. It's going to be troublesome. So understanding those boundaries and understanding proximities and how they affect those relationships, I think, is a large part of building those stronger connections.
Wise words. Nina asks, when you're one of those who fuck around and find out, you face a lot of critique from those who are not so attuned to their tricksters. How does the trickster help you deal with this clash with the world around you?
Oh, yeah, that's easy. That's where you embrace your monkey, right? That monkey energy is very much I just got in trouble, but I'm cute, right? A monkey leans into this capacity to find alternate connections. People will be terrified of the big change you're making. They'll be terrified of you pulling at strings of tradition. And especially in the world we live in right now, where this kind of capitalist culture we're in evaluates everything. And for things to be commodifiable, they need to be delimited in the way that they're tradable. And so tradition, culture, all these things kind of get stuck in places. And the trickster energy kind of pokes at where they're stuck and says, oh, but we need to grow, we need to change. And that threatens their commodifiability. That threatens equity people have after having survived through all these structures. And so when people are in that freak out space after you've fucked around, it's time to back up and change your direction, which we can do because as tricksters, we're polymorphic. We can find another form. We can run off for a while and let the fire fade, and then come back in a completely different form and do the same thing, and eventually people, it kind of works into the story of the space, and people find acceptance of it over time.
Thank you. We have another question that relates somewhat to this, but comes at it from a slightly different direction. Chance asks, what might you suggest for someone who strongly relates to tricksters in their life and their spiritual practice, and is tired of people acting as if this is dangerous or ill-advised? It seems self-evident to me as a gamer, actor, game designer, and fiction writer that, in brackets, good art is a lie that tells the truth, and that the game is a trick you play on yourselves and each other for fun. But I have trouble communicating this to others because of the way people associate trickery with deception. Maybe this is related to how much Lucifer is vilified in Christianized culture. I would love to know what you think.
Oh, I have had such a struggle with this. Let me think of so it's part and parcel to that issue where the other archetypes are allowed to kind of have their good and bad, and Trickster is going to disrupt one way or another. As a player, I have totally been this person, right? I have been I'm always asking, why does this rule work this way? Blah, 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 blah. I'm making characters who explore various strange rules and play systems. And it was always hard to kind of get buy-in from the people around us. Again, I think the shape changeriness of the Trickster is an important part of that. I feel like being able to take forms that can have the conversations. Like, so sometimes when we're trying to be seen, we draw a line and say, you can only see me this way because we're focused on this narrative that we're trying to bring into the world. But if we embrace that, if we truly embrace that Trickster, the Trickster knows it's going to show up one way or another, right? So you don't have to draw that line. What you can do is open a box and invite other people to come into the box and walk around them, engage around them, and find the places where they get activated, and then find ways to connect your own activation to their activations. And so eventually that the spider energy comes in, and they're so woven into your prosperity, and you're so woven into their prosperity that it becomes, I think, considerably less frightening. But it's not easy. It is long work. It is like making the bed where you pull one side, the other side comes up. You have to keep doing the shifting and adjusting. You have to keep mining your failures for gold, right? Panning your failures for gold, dipping into it, figuring out what went wrong, taking that thing that went wrong, putting it out, and seeing if you can create a new narrative from the thing that went wrong and turn it into a nugget of rightness that helps move you where you need to go. So at the end of the day, it's about not just kind of being a trickster. I think, and again, we have this connotation of being a trickster, just being, I do whatever I want to do, and y'all will just have to accept me as I am, kind of thing. But a healthy trickster is part of an ecology, and that trickster is actively keeping that whole ecology in motion, and is not just about them. Sometimes they're just stories of where the trickster isn't even there. It's about what the trickster did, and everyone else is rushing to kind of engage it, fix it, celebrate it, and do whatever.
We have a question here, if there are examples of mostly female perceived tricksters.
So the first one that comes to my mind is Gretel, and Hansel and Gretel. Actually, I feel like there's lots of them in Baltic Slavic folklore. There's Gretel, there's Vasilisa, there's the young lady whose name I can't remember, who I'm just going to call another Vasilisa because there's lots of Vasilisas. In American folklore, there's like a lot of Appalachian stories that have female characters, and there's one that stands out to me called Mutsmag, which is kind of a Jack story. And it's interesting because it's about a young woman who is she's brought in as a house girl, which lends to the thought that she might be it's an old story, and so she might be mulatto, and she's being brought into this household to kind of cook and clean and take care of these other non-mixed kids. And but the family is all terrible, and she winds up engaging with her sisters and running off and having all these adventures, and she keeps saving everybody through her trickery. And of course, there's Pippi Longstocking, right? Pippi is like the queen. Baba Yaga is a trickster, right? There's a tendency to take a lot of I think the female presenting trickster characters and try to push them into an archetype, because the patriarchal space wants those important tricksters to be male. But Baba Yaga is mighty. So many witch characters are all about that transformation and adjustment and opening people's eyes, and they're living totally in that trickster space. But they kind of get put into this other space to kind of separate them from that. But I don't think it's hard to come across. Hoping that answers your questions. Kali Durga, yes. Kali is a wonderful warrior, destructor, trickster.
Great. Menachem asks, you spoke how important it is to work with / address sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. in games. In many games I've played, during safety mechanics, we decide to play in a world without such things. It gives a certain freedom. Can you share some thoughts about playing in such situations and how to address or ask the questions you suggest when we remove homophobia, etc.?
That's an interesting and a big question. Safety mechanics. So I think in most situations, and I think there's different ways to go about that. In most situations, there is the conversation that happens before we actually even sit down to play the game about, you know, what's there's like X cards and those kind of things, right? Where we say this, these are the things that aren't allowed, these are things that are uncomfortable, these are the absolute no's. But then there's a thing that happens when we actually build the world and try to engage a world that doesn't have these problems. And I think that's a far tougher thing to engage. They don't have any really solid, concrete answers because they're ongoing conversations, right? It's like, so in Edgewater, for example, has a lot of very queer themes in it. There's multiple genders, there's all this stuff. There's this idea of bodies and self, and even the magic has these themes of weaving people together, and everything's broken into these small parts. But many people coming into the game, they don't come with that, right? And so what winds up happening is that even though the world has these structures in there, we are still human, and we come in with our own legacy baggage. And so it becomes this soft adjustment where we bring people in and we get them to a point where they're comfortable and they have enough that they can connect with things that they recognize. And then we slowly either pull some of those things away and say, well, that doesn't exist here, or that looks like this here. We just wait until it shows up, and then we can stop and go, this thing that you're trying to do, that doesn't fit here, and it doesn't fit here because. And it's a tough conversation. I feel it's a tough conversation because if you have a solid group, a good game group is something you grow into, right? It is a relationship, and it's a relationship that makes room for people to make mistakes. And so being able to stop and kind of acknowledge the mistake and then kind of move on, I think, is important. When you're with like conventions, I think convention spaces are terrible for this, right? Where there is no relationship, there's no kinship, and there's only power structures, right? There's like, I own, people are kind of fighting for ownership of space and ownership of being seen. And in those spaces, I think the only thing you can do, because it's also short-lived, is to have structures in place when you first sit down to have those conversations, say, these are the things that aren't allowed, and not to have, and the discussion is short and it's absolute. But then afterwards, when you're done, if people want to stick around and play or stick around and have deeper conversations, you can talk a little bit deeper about that. But I'm not a fan of like short games like that, one-offs in spaces where everyone's a stranger. I'm much more a fan of trying to build a long-term relationship with other people and then have those conversations, because I feel like a lot of times when we just kind of shut people down immediately, that kind of activates all these wounds that are connected to like all these narratives of equity that people have in their hierarchies or their matriarchies or their homophobia or whatever. And there's no place to have those conversations, so everyone's kind of sitting there uncomfortable, and people are ready to find an opportunity to show that they're being marginalized and then they're being put upon, and we just get all persnickety and sticky and angry, and it just doesn't feel like a healthy space. So I think that's a much bigger, longer conversation, and I'm more than happy to have that with Menachem, because Menachem is here in Chicago with me, and we can chat much deeper about this.
Perfect. And this also segues to possibly our last question today, coming back to Hannah, who says, it's so lovely to hear about the story of your RPG family. Yes, really well played games. Many RPG or LARP groups do not have the same wonderful success. One answer might be the one you propose, that they did not let the trickster in. I think you're partly right, but I'm also thinking, what if the reason for the RPG success you have seen is your beautiful personality, who are transforming the space and the people around you? I believe some people have great ability to transform both themselves and others. And for others, all the advice in the world won't help.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Actually, speaking towards that, there's one of the things that in Edgewater, when I was listening to what are the ways that people represent themselves, and I was still kind of working within the boxes, I added this extra gender, and it's kind of like an uber gender, and I called it the gatherer, because, and the idea behind the gatherer is that the gatherer is their resonance is about drawing people to them and building community. It doesn't matter what you look like. They're always, when they come into the world, and their energy is completely scattered. And so they're assembling people and they make the difference. That's their role in the world. And I think there are so many of us who have that, and our role directly leads into a space of eldership where we build trust and people come to us and they're willing to, when we say what if, they're willing to give us the benefit of the doubt and engage our trickster in the what if, in a way that they may not have been willing to do with other people. So recognizing your own voice as a trickster and how it affects the room that you're in is a huge part of making those spaces feel good. And I see Sarah has her hand up.
I just don't want you to go away, so I'm going to ask more questions.
Okay.
The way I hear you talk about these experiences is so evocative, it's so powerful. And I'm wondering if you're having those kinds of conversations around the table and with your co-players. Like, are you processing these experiences in this way off game? Because it seems like that might also lead to this deep connection that you're describing in these role-playing groups.
Right. So right now, I'm not actually, am I involved in any games? I was involved in a game with Malcolm actually not long ago, and that was very much focused around some of those questions. And it was a game about spiritual. It had a very spiritual growth aspect to it. But in my other spaces are much more focused around play and observation. So I'm working with teachers in CPS, the Chicago Public School System. And those are kind of social emotional learning conversations, but being focused around the power of play to engage those things. There is a theater company here in Chicago, Other World Theaters, that I'm one of their advisors for, and they do all these awesome LARPs. And so I'm joining their crew to help with those LARPs. So I'm doing one this weekend where as a player, but I'll be coming in as a participant. And one of the goals for bringing me in as a participant is to help with some of those questions, and also to help build spaces that are much more accessible to us, particularly people of color, because so much, and we've had these big conversations about how so much of people's de facto ideas of fantasy are super focused on this kind of Euro fantasy hegemony. Whatever. What I mean, my tongue isn't working anymore. The trickster's in my mouth. But in that, what does it look like to start creating spaces that center people of color, but at the same time do not give permission for people to put on blackface or red face, or right? It's about building those empathic relationships and saying you can exist in this space, but your existence isn't decided by your ability to look or act like one of these stereotypes, right? How do we meet in these spaces, allow you to be you, but at the same time recognize that I'm encouraging you to look through the world, not through a behavior, but through a lens, right? And then that lens reveals all these things to us, and we have conversations about how we interact with those lenses. But we're not trying to necessarily replicate a particular behavior or act black or act native or indigenous or anything like that. Does that answer?
But it sounds like you're having processing conversations with them off game.
Off game, sometimes in game, much more is very conscious off game. How do we build these spaces kind of conversations? And I get actually turned on by those conversations. I get really excited because the other thing that's important to me, and it's also very important to my Trickster thing, is not to be stuck. So a lot of those conversations about how do we build this thing so you don't need me to be there to keep it moving, because I got to go play somewhere else, right? I've got places to go, things to be.
Brilliant. Well, I will have to digest all of this for a while now. This has been an immense pleasure. I think we are at our closing time. Thank you so much, Ellen, for visiting us today and sharing your beautiful thoughts with us. We will continue the conversation online.
Absolutely.
And I give the final word back to Sarah.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. That was everything I'd hoped for and more. I really appreciate how vulnerable you were with us and sharing your personal past and your experience with play. So we are ending the end of our lecture series component of this particular semester, I guess, fall semester. And we are going to be transitioning into our roundtable. So we've had 5 speakers. And in 2 weeks on November 9th, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Sparkles, we will be having our roundtable. So, you know, it's wonderful, of course, to hear these lectures and to hear all these wonderful insights, but it's magic when we get everybody in the same room bouncing ideas off of each other. So super excited for that. We will be announcing the details about that tomorrow. Thank you so much. And thank you for those of you who attended today.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
You too.